here with Carrie McLaren. Carrie is OR's newest author and the creator of Ape Shit, our upcoming zine about monkeys and apes and how we view them in our culture and society.
Yep, their relationships with human beings.
It's great to have you, Carrie. Thanks for being here. To start, can you tell me what caused you to put together this magazine? Why make it about apes?
I just have a long-standing interest in primates, and I did a zine, I'd say 25 years ago that was more about media and consumer culture, and quit doing that. And I just really needed a creative project, and I'd had this long-standing interest in it. And at first I was like, oh, monkeys, apes has nothing to do with all the stuff that I did with my old zine, which was Stay Free. So it'll be new, it'll be more interesting for me. But then the more I studied non-human primates, I kind of realized that a lot of the same issues that come up in society and culture and politics with humans come up with our relationship with other animals, and specifically monkeys and apes. And I wanted to do a zine. I think that as a writer, I'm okay. As a graphic designer, I'm okay. But where I really feel like I get in the flow and I'm really enjoying what I'm doing is when I can blend those two together and to make something out of that. The use of images and the use of text and curating things, anecdotes from history. So,
what is specific to our relationship with primates we don't have with other kinds of animals?
I mean, the thing that people will say is that we are the most evolutionary. We are the closest connection to non-human primates than we are to other mammals. So we do see them differently. When you really look below the surface, a lot of the behaviors that you see in non-human primates, you see in other animals. So I've kind of come around to this view, which I didn't have in the beginning when I first started learning about monkeys and apes, that they're really not that special.
There are like several sections in issue 1, which is what we're talking about, where humans are just speaking about specifically Capuchin monkeys in this very like affectionate but also, paternalistic way, basically talking about them as children. Why do we like to see ourselves in capuchins or in monkeys?
The whole monkey moms phenomenon goes way back. I write about it in this issue because it comes up in this case study of, this issue focuses on using these capuchin monkeys as basically caregivers for people with disabilities, people with quadriplegia. And one of the aspects of this program that really became popular was that it allowed empty nesters to raise capuchin monkeys as if they were their own children. And, people really wanted to do that. But at the time, even in the 70s, there was an increasing understanding that monkeys have no place in a human household. What this program did to kind of shift that is it gave it a halo. It said, oh, well, you're going to be raising these monkeys and parenting them for a good cause. We write about that. I mean, I think that the monkey moms phenomenon is not one that we spent a lot of time looking at in this issue, but it's something that comes up in like the documentary Chimp Crazy. I don't know if anyone has seen the film Chimp Crazy, but that was initially going to be about monkey moms, this phenomenon. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Tell me about this organization, Helping Hands, and why they started, and they're still going, right?
Yeah, they're going under a different name, and they're no longer placing monkeys.
Okay.
They started in the late 70s by a woman, Mary Jo Willard, who was working with a man he was a paraplegic, I believe, and he was very depressed, and she wanted something to kind of help with his therapy. And she had been seeing a lot of Hollywood movies and had this idea of what chimps could do, because chimps have hands and they are beneath us. So why don't we make the chimp be a servant for people with these severe spinal cord injuries? And this at the time was a new phenomenon, because previously, if you had a kind of catastrophic injury that left you with no moving arms or legs, you would not survive that, basically. But they had the technology keeping folks alive. So this was a new thing, and she wanted to study it. She was immediately realized that chimps would be a horrible idea because they will rip your face off. How I came across them, I was studying the history of pet monkeys for my own interest. I also do some editing on Wikipedia, just like to kill time. It's a fun thing to do. And when I was doing this research on pet monkeys, I could start over time seeing the ebb and flow of the nature of these news stories. And what I found was that starting in the late 70s and through the 80s especially, millions of articles about pet monkeys, and most of them seem to have a connection to this group, Helping Hands. What I realized, by then going back and looking at more of these pet monkey stories, there was an organization in the 50s called the Simian Society of America. And they were basically like this ladies' club for women who wanted to raise monkeys at home. And they realized that there was no information about how to do this, so they formed this organization. What you saw after a few years, pet monkey populations exploded. It became a huge fad. But then what you also saw in the 70s is that this was way on the decline, and that a lot of the Simian Society folks, they had these chapters all through the US, were saying, yeah, pet monkeys, not a good idea. Pet monkeys don't work in human homes, and they are a nightmare as soon as they become adolescents.
But these groups were primarily women?
I don't have stats on the Simian Society. I am just looking at who was quoted in the newspaper. So this is purely anecdotal. And this is purely me just looking at news stories. And then seeing this huge bump in pet monkey stories connected to this single organization, Helping Hands. Now, Helping Hands was advocating this use of monkeys for people with severe mobility impairments. And what I noticed about these news stories is that the stories that involved someone who was actually in a wheelchair and had quadriplegia, they'd be the same 2 or 3 people, 3 or 4 people, over and over again. But the stories about people raising monkeys to help the people in wheelchairs, millions of people, lots of stories about that, lots of stories about people raising these monkeys as pets, dressing them in clothing, treating them like their children. A lot of them were empty nesters, so they were couples whose children had left to go off to work or go to college, and they felt like they needed a sense of purpose. So that's typically the kind of demographic who would raise these pet monkeys for Helping Hands.
It says so much about how we view disability and disabled people that that's not even relevant to hear from people.
Yeah.
And it's just like the do-goody, like the active being
precisely.
good that people focus on.
I mean, it's funny because in their first decade, after a few years, Helping Hands was funded by the VA. So they got money from the federal government. And then they had to, after 10 years, they got funded as an experiment. But after that 10 years, they'd have to have legislation to continue funding them beyond the experimental stage because they had their experimental period. So at that time, there was a congressional testimony, meetings for Congress to see if they could pass this legislation to fund Helping Hands. They had no data to support their use with people with disabilities because most of the monkeys that they placed did not stay. People did not want them. And, there were a couple that stayed, right? Like and that's why I refer to in the zine, I refer to these unicorn cases where occasionally it works, right? And then that's the story that is promoted and promoted and promoted. But anyway, getting back to your point, when the critics of this organization spoke before Congress, one of the points that they made was, they paid well over $1 million to this organization. With this money, you could have funded this new research into robotics for people with these mobility disimpairments. You could have had 20 people with this robotic arms, which were very promising new technology at that time. And instead, you've got 2 veterans with monkeys. So that was it. After a decade and well over $1 million, they had 2 veterans that had monkeys. So it was very inefficient, and there was no effort to ask their target population meaning people in wheelchairs. What would you like us to do? What do you need? It was always they had the solution of the monkeys, and they were looking to find whoever would take them.
Crazy way to go about helping people. And like, you go into detail in the zine about there are just so many decades of this not working, and why did they keep trying when it was so clear that this is not an effective program?
That's the thing that floors me as much as anything. 42 years. So Helping Hands continued up until the pandemic. You know, you can see this, in the 70s. The 70s, they did all these crazy things. The 80s, they did all these crazy things. But like, they continued going. They were promoting it on Facebook. As to why, one reason was media coverage was only This was such a feel-good. Like, if you see the pictures, people found them so adorable, so enchanting. This is like really tugging on the heartstrings. Seems like a win-win. Seems like a feel-good story. And then when the word comes out, actually there's a lot of messed up stuff. This is really a terrible idea. Nobody wants to cover that. Like, media never wants to cover any story involving animals where the animals are harmed. So that's one thing. The other thing was that Helping Hands was isolated. They were working out of Boston University. They had some connection to Boston University. They were using a lot of students. And Boston University doesn't have a program for primate behavior or really like animal behavior, something that where they could have people could say, you know what, this is really not right, and this really isn't working. They didn't have that external pressure. I think the other thing is, and this is just pure opinion speculation on my part, that some of the people working in the organization, they just really wanted to be with monkeys. They just really wanted to have that. I think there's something in humanity, like our psychology, where we're connected to wildlife, and if wildlife accepts us, then we're good people. It's special. It makes us special. I mean, there was a story, I didn't write about this in the zine, but where a staff member used her connection with Helping Hands to meet David Sedaris and to then get David Sedaris to do a talk for them and to do a benefit for them. And so, I think it was something that was kind of for the folks who stayed with them, there was something they got out of it.
That's interesting how we like really want these kinds of relationships with animals to work, to kind of absolve us of our guilt of how we treat animals.
Yeah.
Humans use animals in so many ways as like service animals, especially dogs. Why are capuchins not good service animals? What happened with the capuchins in people's homes?
A lot of people know about chimps, right? Chimps are so adorable when they're young. And they're compliant. They're much more compliant than when they get older. As soon as they hit adolescence and the hormones start kicking in, they're wild animals, and they are unsafe around humans. Not only are they unsafe around humans, it's terrible for them to be isolated from their peers and to be held captive in human homes. Capuchins are in many ways like chimps. They are behaviorally very similar to chimps. The difference between capuchins and chimps is that capuchins are 9 pounds. So they were like, well, we can use capuchins because they're not as dangerous as chimps, and we'll just pull all of their teeth out. So you would never pull all of the teeth out of a dog to make a dog a companion or a service animal, but you had to pull the teeth out of the capuchins. They did behavioral training where they would basically shock the monkeys. They would wear a belt and they'd have a little shock pack so that they put stickers on belongings where they would, if the monkey would touch it, they'd first an annoying buzz, and if it continued, they get a little shock. Now, Helping Hands reported that they did phase out the shocking over the years. We would just have to take their word for it. I don't know, but the thing about capuchins that makes them terrible in human homes, their environmental niche, where they are indigenous, where they grow up in the jungle, okay? Their environmental niche is accessing foods that are difficult for other monkeys to access and other arboreal animals to access. And by that I mean they use tools to smack open hard shells. They rip off bark. They've got giant canines for doing this. They are little bruisers, and so they have masterful ways of taking fruits a part that other animals just simply can't do. They haven't figured it out, okay? So what they do in a human home is their natural inclination is to destroy things. And when they're miserable, when they're unhappy, they are very socially aware. So what they will do when they are unhappy in their social environment is they know how to push humans' buttons. So they will take whatever it is that's meaningful to you as the person in the household, and they will destroy it. There are so many cases of that happening, and that was reported back in the 1800s of capuchins doing that, finding the thing that you care about. You know, there was a writer, George Romanus, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. He was a follower of Darwin and wrote a lot about animals and animal cognition and animal intelligence. And he wrote about capuchins very early, and he noted that them destroying like papers, that, you know, he would write anything that they seemed to show any care about, the capuchin would destroy when they're unhappy, when the human chains them up because they don't want their stuff destroyed.
You had some amazing anecdotes of just it was like one capuchin who like took the pages of a book and put them in the aquarium and short-circuited the lights because they put the lamp inside the aquarium too.
That was a story from Konrad Lorenz, who was a very famous ethologist, I think is how you say it. He wrote this story that when he left once, he had a capuchin who ripped all the books off the shelf. This was a guy who loved books, and threw them in the aquarium, just took apart his personal libraries, just destroyed it. And, there are more minor stories of them living in homes where, initially Helping Hands would let families with dogs have a monkey. And then what would happen is the Capuchin would say, like, be in their cage and hold out a little piece of food or fruit for the dog, and then the dog would come over, and then the Capuchin would slap the dog. I mean, they would do things to make themselves feel a little more empowered,
I mean, they're like kind of entertaining stories, but then you remember it's because that they were living in these really
they're captive,
awful conditions.
But there are entertaining stories of capuchins not in captive conditions. I mean, I tried to in the zine. I did 8 pages on capuchins in the wild and things that have been observed there. And that's where they really shine. And they're just these wonderful, weird, social, funny creatures. I didn't want to normalize too much their place with humans.
Over the course of researching this zine, did you learn anything about capuchins that you didn't know before? Or
I learned everything about capuchins I learned before. I mean, I read 2 capuchin behavior books, The Complete Capuchin and Manipulative Monkeys, both excellent books, and they were super helpful. And then, in fact, both authors, Complete Capuchin has 3 authors, but I only corresponded with one. But both of them ended up contributing stuff for the zine. One gave me a good story for how capuchins resist captivity, and one, Susan Perry, gave me a photo, because a lot of these scholars, when they're doing work in the field, they need to get funded, and it's hard for them to get funded to do their field research. And so in particular, she was getting some funding from National Geographic. So a lot of the images that she took, I couldn't use because they were proprietary. And so she's like, this one's in the public domain. You can use this. So I was like, yay, thank you.
Did you ever interact with Helping Hands or try to reach out to them?
Oh, I definitely tried to reach out to them several times, but they didn't help. They're called Envisioning Access now. Okay. So they're no longer called Helping Hands. During the pandemic, they rebranded. They sent out a note kind of saying that the environment for them doing this was no longer made sense, which it really hadn't made sense for a couple of decades. So, I mean, I'm glad they finally folded, but it almost seemed like they were blaming airlines because they couldn't ship the monkeys on airlines anymore. They were blaming state regulations. The states had been cracking down on people having primates as pets because it's a terrible idea to have a primate as a pet. So it was almost like, they were fighting against the man and losing against the man. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to tell this story is because people hadn't told it before. And, 100 years from now, somebody, is looking back on society and they're like, oh, capuchins were used as service animals. Maybe we could. No, terrible idea. I wanted it to be documented for exactly why it was such a terrible idea.
You have some there's a section where you go into the history of capuchins in music playing.
Yeah.
And it's
They're
really awful.
Organ grinder monkeys.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what it was one of the funny things that Helping Hands would do is they'd say, oh, capuchins are organ grinder monkeys. But when you look at the history of organ grinder monkeys, it's really, it's hilariously awful. The way they were trained, the way they were treated, how they just became this disruptive force in the city. This was in the late 1800s, and impoverished men would use the hand organ, which was this machines that made what a lot of people considered to be a very horrible sound.
You had some very funny quotes about people.
Yeah, there was a lot of hate about the organ grinder, and the reason why it had became used so widely is because there were laws against panhandling unless you were a musician or an artist, and so this was something that you could make music with even if you had no musical talent. And it was usually men. There were kids doing it earlier, but that's another story. And they would have the capuchin on a chain, and they would train the capuchin to collect coins. And sometimes they would let them roam and go up to the apartment windows to collect coins there. And there were cases of them going into apartments and just taking things out of apartments. It's not just in New York, but DC and Chicago. And so eventually these cities started passing ordinances to stop people from having pet monkeys.
And you described their extraordinary ability to get out of cages. It was pretty amazing.
I mean, it stems from how they've evolved in their environments. And some of the fruits they have to access have these needles surrounding them. It's very difficult. So they've figured out ways to hack into, certain trees, or there are trees that have, spikes on them that they've had to learn how to navigate. So they're just very crafty critters. And the other thing that the scientists say about capuchins, folks who study them, is that they are very dogged in their approach. They do not give up. Once they set their sight on cracking a lock, they just will keep at it. A lot of animals, a lot of monkeys aren't like that. They're just enough. Chimps are certainly, chimps are people will talk about them as if they have ADHD because they'll try it really fast and then they'll just quit after a while.
Well, I sympathize.
Exactly, right?
Is there anything that you would have liked to include in the zine that you did?
Oh my gosh, the whole thing. I mean, the Helping Hand story was initially just going to be a small part of a zine about efforts to use monkeys and apes as cheap labor. Because there are a lot of cases of this happening. And Helping Hands was just the most serious effort, aside from coconut picking, which does go way back. But the Helping Hands story, when I had my friend read it, it was already 3,000 words, and which for me, that's a long story. And she's like, well, you didn't answer this, and you need to explain this more, and you need to add this, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's going to make a really long story. And then the zine ballooned into 70 pages, and so then I just, this issue is going to focus on helper monkeys, and then we'll look at the other cases of labor in another issue. So the next issue, so now I have the idea for my next issue, which will look at things that came before Helping Hands.
But also service?
Precedents.
Or
they weren't used as caregivers, no. I mean, that was a uniquely stupid idea.
Yeah. It says also so much about how our relationship with labor and caregiving, that all these monkeys, we're just filling in for labor that we don't want to and do or put the resources into.
Well, I mean, that's the funny thing about the first in her first journal piece, Mary Jo Willard, who founded Helping Hands, wrote that this would be an alternative to human care. She also said the monkeys aren't going to replace human helpers, but they will supplement and make it more affordable. And she also said in her paper that monkeys are going to be less likely to exploit the disabled than humans, than human caregivers. Oh, but you asked me too about, did I reach out to Helping Hands? I did reach out to Helping Hands and didn't hear back from them, but I did hear from someone who worked at Helping Hands in the early days.
Yeah.
So I interviewed her, Allison Pascoe, and she was their trainer for 6 years. And so that was really helpful.
What did you get from her in your interview with her?
She confirmed a lot of what I knew. She had became a bit of a whistleblower early on, and she had done an Inside Edition interview, kind of exposing Helping Hands. And I could never get a copy of that episode. I tried. She talked a lot of experientially, what she got out of it, why she thought, and I think her take was interesting. She argues that what kept it going is that when it worked, when a Capuchin did have a bond with their recipient, it was just a beautiful thing to see. And that occasionally it did work. And those were, when I mentioned that there were stories that were repeated over and over in the news, that would typically be the case. Somebody who had just, for whatever reason, the monkey fit. Occasionally you'll get a very calm monkey.
Yeah, there were some moving stories of how important they were emotionally to the people that they fit well with.
Yes, and you could go online and there are very emotional stories. I mean, I'd get teary for it. You just have to ask yourself, is this fair to the monkey? And for every monkey that does make this connection, most don't. And that is evidenced by the fact that Helping Hands was breeding monkeys. Disney World helped breed Helping Hands monkeys. And they didn't want male monkeys. So what do? Capuchins also over-index in their births. Males are over-indexed. They tend to breed more males. I think scientists aren't quite sure why that is, but it may be because males do in the wild, they die more readily than females. Males are bigger and they're less tractable. They just didn't work. I think in the case of 42 years, I saw maybe one male monkey that was represented. What Allison talked about, one of the things that she talked about is that even when you pull out all their teeth, Capuchins still, they clamp down like a pit bull. So they may have no teeth, but it still really hurts.
Yeah, you had some photos of injuries that were really gruesome. I mean, even those examples of when it does work, it seems like it didn't work in the way that, like, it was kind of supposed to as a service animal.
Yeah.
It was more
worked
as
a companion. Yes. There are animals who would be less miserable as a companion, namely dogs.
We have such a specific use that we try to sort of fit basically all animals into, and I feel like sometimes when they're domesticated, you kind of control that behavior more easily, but even that is kind of could be questionable.
Yeah, and in the next issue, I do want to look at domestication. I mean, my views are constantly evolving on all this stuff, but one of the themes that would come up from Helping Hands is this blurring of domestication with taming. Monkeys were not domesticated. They are wild animals, and they will always be wild animals. Even if you raise them with human and get them acclimated to human homes, they need to be with other monkeys. And what happens when they're not with other monkeys is that they suffer catastrophic physical and emotional problems.
You end with some very moving anecdotes also of monkeys who've been brought to this animal rescue, I think, in Florida, where they've been able to find new connections and try to recover.
There's a sanctuary called Jungle Friends that was founded by a woman who had 2 Capuchin monkeys and realized what a horrible mistake it was too late. And this is kind of how a lot of primate sanctuaries were founded, by people who were former pet owners and didn't have anything to do with their animals when they knew they could no longer keep them at home, didn't want to put them down, which there's no data on it, but that's got to be what happens to most of the animals, right? They're euthanized, and I say euthanized in quotes because it's not like they're doing it for medical necessity. They're doing it because they were bred to do something they were not meant to do. The primate sanctuaries, I did want to show the valuable work that primate sanctuaries do, because there are animals that come there that have been in human environments for years and are super sick and are doing stereotypical behaviors and have diabetes and all kinds of ailments. And once they get out in the sunshine and once they get access to trees and other monkeys, completely different animal. And I think that we humans underestimate their ability to have very different lives and to adjust.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.